The station floated in the middle of nowhere. No star was close enough to warm it. No planet was near enough to cast a shadow on it. It hung in the black silence of deep space like a forgotten coin tossed into a dark ocean. Its name was Conclave Station Orin, and on this particular day, it held the most powerful military minds in the known galaxy. 6 species had been invited. 5 of them had arrived with pride. The 6th had arrived with coffee. The Great Hall of Orin was massive. Its ceiling was so high that the upper corners were lost in shadow. The walls were made of a pale, smooth material that reflected everything: the lights, the faces, the holographic displays that floated above each delegation's table like glowing ghosts. There were 6 tables arranged in a circle. 5 of them had entire teams seated behind them: advisors, admirals, military analysts, and translators. The 6th table had 2 people: Ambassador Alara Voss and her assistant, a quiet young man named Kale who mostly carried things. The purpose of this gathering was simple, at least on the surface. The 5 great alien civilizations had agreed, after years of careful diplomatic letters and 3 near wars, to hold a formal military exhibition. Each species would present its most powerful warship. They would demonstrate their weapons. They would share enough information to remind everyone in the room why starting a conflict with them would be a very bad idea. It was, in the polite language of galactic diplomacy, called a summit of mutual transparency. In plain language, it was a competition. Everyone knew it. No one said it out loud. The Vreth went first. The Vreth were insected. They stood roughly 2 meters tall on 4 legs, with 2 additional arms used for tool handling and gesturing. Their bodies were covered in a hard, dark shell the color of old iron. Their ambassador, a high-ranking military officer named Commander Scrix, walked to the center of the hall and activated a holographic display so large that it stretched nearly wall to wall. What appeared above the room made several delegates lean back in their seats. It was a carrier ship, but calling it a carrier ship was like calling an ocean a puddle. The vessel was 40 kilometers long. Its surface was covered in launch bays, thousands of them, each one housing a smaller attack craft. The Vreth did not believe in single powerful ships. They believed in numbers, swarms. Their philosophy of war was simple: you could destroy 100 ships, maybe even 1,000. But could you destroy 10,000? Could you destroy 50,000? The answer, historically, had been no. Scrix spoke in the clicking, rapid language of the Vreth, and the translation system in the hall converted it to a smooth, neutral voice. The Vreth supremacy presents the Hive carrier Undying Swarm. 1 ship, 12,000 attack craft housed within. In combat, our enemies do not fight a fleet, they fight a storm. He paused to let that settle. A storm has no throat to cut. A storm does not retreat. There was quiet in the room, impressed quiet. Then the Durok went. The Durok were reptilian and ancient. Their species had been traveling the stars before most of the other civilizations in the room had learned to make fire. They were large, broad-shouldered creatures with thick-scaled skin in shades of green and gray. They moved slowly, but everything about them suggested that slow was a choice, not a limitation. Their lead delegate, Admiral Vorath, did not even stand up to present. He simply gestured, and the holographic display above the Durok table activated on its own. The ship that appeared was a dreadnought. It looked like a mountain that had decided to move. It was not as long as the Vreth carrier, but it was dense, layered in armor so thick that the display had to zoom in just to show the detail. Every surface was reinforced. Every angle was designed to deflect. The ship had been in service for over 4,000 years, upgraded continuously, but never destroyed. Its name was the Iron Throne, and it had ended wars simply by appearing in orbit above a planet. The Iron Throne has never been boarded, Vorath said, his voice low and unhurried. It has never been disabled. It has never retreated. 4,000 years, 12 wars, 0 losses. He folded his thick hands on the table. We do not build ships to impress. We build ships to last. More quiet. A different kind this time. The kind that comes when people believe what they are hearing. The Salmari went next. The Salmari were perhaps the strangest species in the room. They did not have solid bodies in the traditional sense. They existed as beings of structured energy, light, and charge, held in a specific shape by technology and biology working together. They moved inside containment suits, tall and narrow, that gave them a humanoid outline but revealed nothing inside except a soft, pulsing glow. Their ships matched their nature, crystalline, elegant, and powered by photon energy that most other species still did not fully understand. Their representative, Speaker Lyris, brought up a ship that looked almost beautiful compared to the others. Long, sharp, translucent in places, catching the light of the holographic display and scattering it in soft colors across the hall walls. But beauty was not the point. The point was the weapon mounted at its prow, a photon lance that, when fired at full power, had once cracked the crust of a small planet during a demonstration 300 years ago. Not destroyed. Cracked. Like an egg tapped on the edge of a bowl. "The eternal prism," Lyris said softly. "Our philosophy is not armor, it is not numbers, it is precision. One shot placed correctly ends any argument." The Phoenixi went forth. The Phoenixi were smaller than the others, lean and quick, with large eyes adapted for low light and fingers that were almost always moving. They were primarily a trading civilization, but trade routes needed protection, and over centuries, they had built some of the fastest warships in known space. Their vessels could not take a hit the way the Durocs could. They could not fire a planet-cracking beam like the Salmari, but they could be behind you before you knew they had left their own side of the room. Their admiral, a sharp-faced female named Coronet, smiled when she activated her display. The ship was almost sleek enough to look unarmed. "The Hollow Wind," she said, "fastest vessel in any documented fleet. It does not survive battles by winning them. It survives by choosing which battles happen and which ones don't." She let the smile sharpen. "We have never lost a ship in a fight we didn't choose first." Then came the Akarath. The Akarath were unsettling to most other species. They were tall and thin, with pale skin and large dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They communicated primarily through psionic signals, a form of mind-to-mind transmission, though they used audio speech when required for formal settings. Their ships were built around this ability. Their warships carried psionic disruptors, devices that did not fire lasers or missiles, but instead targeted the minds of enemy crews, causing confusion, fear, paralysis, or worse. Their delegate, Elder San, said very little during the presentation. He showed the ship, long and dark, with strange geometric patterns on the hull that seemed to shift when you looked at them directly, and then said only this: "Our ship does not kill enemies. It convinces them to surrender or to turn on each other. The result is the same." He paused. "The mind is the oldest battlefield." By the time the fifth presentation ended, the hall was thick with a kind of competitive energy. Each species was clearly measuring the others. Eyes moved from table to table. Small private conversations happened behind hands and in whispered alien languages. And through all of it, Ilara Voss sat still. She had listened to every word. She had watched every display. She had not leaned forward with interest or leaned back with concern. She had simply sat with her hands resting on the table and a small, paper cup of coffee, real coffee, brought from Earth, cooling slowly beside her left hand. Kale sat behind her, a data chip held loosely in his fingers, waiting. The session moderator, a senior conclave official from a neutral species, finally turned to the human table. His tone was polite but carried a slight note of condescension that was hard to miss. "Ambassador Voss, the Terran delegation may now present." Several of the other delegates glanced over. A few had already looked away, as if they expected this part to be brief and unremarkable. Admiral Vorath of the Duroc had not even fully turned in his chair. Commander Skrix of the Vreth clicked something quietly to a colleague that the translator caught only partially, something about the young ones. Ilara picked up her coffee and took one slow sip. She set it down. She looked at the room, at the enormous holographic warships still glowing above 5 tables, at the admirals and commanders and speakers, who had just spent the better part of 2 hours explaining to the galaxy why they were not to be challenged. Then she held out her hand without looking back. Kale placed the data chip in it. She set it on the table and slid it forward a few centimeters, like a person who had just played a card and was waiting for the others to realize what it meant. "We didn't bring a display," she said. Her voice was calm and even. Not quiet, she spoke clearly enough for the whole room to hear. "We didn't bring an admiral. We didn't bring a fleet model or a weapons chart or a tactical summary." She looked at the chip. "What we brought is a schedule." She looked back up at the room. "A date, a time, and coordinates. That's all you'll need." Admiral Vorath turned fully in his chair now. Ilara finished her coffee. "Tomorrow," she said, "deep space, you'll see it yourselves." The hall was very quiet. Not the impressed quiet from before. A different quiet. The kind that happens when a room full of very confident people suddenly isn't sure what to think. Ilara stood, nodded once to the session moderator and walked out. Kale followed, carrying the empty coffee cup. That night, the corridors of Conclave Station Orin were quieter than usual, but the rooms behind closed doors were anything but. Every delegation had retreated to its own quarters, and in each of those quarters the same activity was taking place. Screens were lit. Analysts were working. Intelligence files were being pulled, searched, and cross-referenced. Every species at the summit had its own version of a spy network. Information gathered quietly over decades through diplomats, traders, and the kind of listening technology that was never mentioned in formal agreements. And every single one of those networks, when pointed at humanity, came back with the same frustrating result. Not enough. The Vreth intelligence officer assigned to the human delegation had been sending reports back to Commander Scrix all evening. Each one was shorter than the last, which was itself a bad sign. The final message read simply, "Our records on the Terran fleet are incomplete. Significantly incomplete. Recommend caution." Scrix had read it 3 times. In the Phoenixy quarters, Admiral Coronet sat with 2 of her top analysts and a wall covered in data points about humanity, trade records, colony expansion maps, historical communication intercepts. She tapped one section, a cluster of files from about 60 years ago, and frowned. Something had changed in that period. The communications had shifted tone. Less civilian traffic, more encrypted signals. A quiet, sustained increase in resource movement that at the time had been written off as infrastructure development. Now, looking at it with fresh eyes, it looked less like infrastructure and more like production. "How long have they been building?" she asked. Her lead analyst hesitated. "Our best estimate is 60 years, possibly longer." Coronet sat back. 60 years was not a long time in galactic terms. For most species, 60 years was barely enough to design a new class of ship, let alone produce one at scale. But humans, she was beginning to understand, did not measure time the way others did. They did not build slowly and carefully over centuries. They built the way they did everything else, urgently, relentlessly, with the particular energy of a species that had never once been able to fully relax. Across the station, a young Phoenixy diplomat named Ciravel was doing her own research, though she would not have called it research. She would have called it curiosity. She had been watching Ilara Voss all day, not out of suspicion, but because something about the human ambassador fascinated her in a way she couldn't quite name. The other delegates had all performed. They had spoken loudly, stood tall, and filled the room with the weight of their civilization's power. Ilara had done none of that. She had sat quietly and said almost nothing, and somehow she had left the hall with more attention on her than anyone else. Ciravel pulled up everything she could find about humanity's history. What she found was not the clean, linear story of most galactic civilizations. Most species, when they reached a certain technological level, stabilized. Wars became rarer. Resources became managed. The culture settled into something sustainable. Humanity's history did not do that. It was messy and violent and full of near misses, moments where the whole species had come within a hair of wiping itself out entirely. Pandemics that had killed hundreds of millions. Wars that had reshaped entire continents. Environmental crises that had pushed civilization to the edge and then, somehow, pulled it back. A nuclear standoff that had lasted decades and ended not with a war but with an exhausted, mutual decision to step back from the edge. Every time the species had survived. Every time it had come back not weaker but different. Harder maybe, more focused, like metal that had been put through fire enough times that it had stopped fearing the heat. Ravel read a section of human history from about 200 years ago, a period humans called the Consolidation, where the various nations of Earth had, after enormous difficulty and more than a few violent conflicts, finally come together under a single planetary government. It had not been a happy unification. It had been a necessary one, forced by the reality that the problems facing humanity, resource depletion, climate instability, and the early signals of other intelligent life in the galaxy, were simply too large for divided nations to face alone. And once they were unified, the thing that had always been present in human nature but scattered in 100 different directions suddenly had somewhere to go. She stopped on a particular entry, a speech given by the first Secretary General of the Unified Earth Government almost exactly 60 years ago. It was not a long speech. It was, in fact, very short. But one line had apparently been quoted so many times afterward that it had become something close to a national motto. She read the translated version slowly. "We have survived everything we have ever faced. Now let us make sure we never have to survive again." She sat with that for a while. Meanwhile, in the human quarters, two small connected rooms that were noticeably less decorated than every other delegation's space, Alara Voss was awake but not working. She was standing at the single observation window, looking out at the black. Kale had gone to sleep an hour ago. She had tried and failed, which was not unusual for her on nights before important days. She thought about the faces in that hall, the Duroc admiral who had not fully turned to look at them, the slight curve of amusement in Commander Scrix's posture, the polite but dismissive tone of the session moderator. She had seen all of it and none of it had made her angry. She had been angry once a long time ago, early in her diplomatic career, when she had first understood how the galaxy saw humanity. Small, young, unproven. A minor species from a single, unremarkable star system, too busy surviving its own history to have done anything worth nodding out here. She had been angry, then she had been motivated, and then she had been too busy, for too many years to think much about feelings at all. The fleet had been her project for the last 20 years. Not hers alone, thousands of engineers, shipyard workers, military planners, and government officials had built it together. But she had been the one who argued for its existence at every budget meeting, every Security Council session, every closed-door debate where someone suggested that humanity should spend its resources on trade instead of steel. She had made the same argument every single time, calmly and without drama, until people stopped arguing with her. The argument was simple. Humanity had not survived this long by being weak, and it had not built a future by being naive. The galaxy was full of powers that respected only one thing above all others: the clear and obvious ability to make a conflict very, very expensive. Not aggression, not the desire to fight, just the unmistakable, visible, undeniable truth that if you started something with humanity, you would pay for it in ways you had not prepared for. She thought about the ships, not the Reckoning specifically. She had seen it dozens of times, but all of them together. The 60 vessels that were waiting in the dark right now, holding position with engines cold and running silent, as they had been trained to do. The crews aboard them, professionals who had spent years training for exactly this kind of moment. The shipyards back home that were still running, 3 shifts a day, still building. She thought about what those alien admirals would see tomorrow and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite satisfaction. It was something quieter than either of those. More like the feeling of finally being able to put something heavy down after carrying it for a very long time. Back in the Akarath quarters, Elder San had not slept either. He was doing what Akarath did when they wanted to understand something. He was reaching out with low-level psionic feelers, not intrusive enough to be considered an attack, just a gentle ambient awareness of the emotional texture of the station. He could not read specific thoughts, but he could feel the general weight of what was present in a space, the way a person might sense whether a room was warm or cold without being told. From the Vreth quarters he felt calculation, from the Duroc controlled unease, from the Fenixi active, bright, almost electric curiosity, from the Salmari something cool and watchful. These were all familiar emotional textures. He knew them well. From the human quarters, he felt almost nothing. Not emptiness, the humans were clearly awake and present, but their emotional output was remarkably contained, controlled in a way that was unusual for a species as young as they were. Most young species were loud emotionally, feelings scattered out in all directions, easy to read, easy to anticipate. Humans were different. Whatever they were feeling, they were keeping it close. San withdrew his awareness and sat in the dark for a while. He had, in his long life, encountered many species that were dangerous. Dangerous in obvious ways, big ships, big weapons, big numbers. Humanity, on the available evidence, appeared to also be dangerous in those ways. But there was something else that he had learned to watch for over the centuries, something that mattered more in the long run than ships and weapons. The species that were truly dangerous were not the ones with the most power. They were the ones that had been shaped by difficulty into something that no longer feared it. He thought about that one translated phrase from the human speech that had circulated through the diplomatic data share earlier in the evening. We have survived everything we have ever faced. Now let us make sure we never have to survive again. He thought about the calm way the human ambassador had placed a data chip on a table and walked out of a room full of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. Then he thought about tomorrow, and for the first time in a very long while, Elder San of the Akarath felt genuinely unsure of what to expect. It was not a comfortable feeling. He decided it was also, probably, the correct one. The coordinates Alara had provided led to a section of deep space 3 light-years from Conclave Station Orin, far from any inhabited system, far from any shipping lane, and far from any curious eyes that had not been specifically invited. The 5 alien fleets had each sent observer vessels, smaller ships equipped with long-range sensor arrays and quantum-linked feeds that would transmit everything back to the main delegations aboard the station in real time. A cluster of 17 vessels now held position around the designated zone, waiting. The zone itself had been prepared in advance. 6 large asteroids, each one roughly 3 kilometers across, had been positioned at equal distances from a central point. Each species had been assigned one. The 6th was for humanity. The morning had started with the alien demonstrations, as agreed. The Vreth went first, as they had in the hall. Commander Skrix had selected a mid-weight attack wing rather than the full hive carrier. The deep space zone was not large enough for the undying swarm to operate meaningfully, but the wing he sent was still an impressive thing to watch. 40 attack craft dropped out of FTL in a tight formation, split instantly into 4 groups the moment they arrived, encircled the target asteroid from multiple angles, and then, on a single signal, opened fire simultaneously. The asteroid did not just break apart. It became a cloud of fragments in under 3 seconds, the pieces scattering outward in a clean sphere pattern that told you the attack had been perfectly coordinated. Not a single shot had crossed another. Not a single craft had been in the path of friendly fire. The observers noted it carefully. Efficient, disciplined, devastating. The Duroc sent a single ship, a heavy cruiser, not the Iron Throne itself, but built along the same philosophy of layered armor and overwhelming forward firepower. It approached the asteroid slowly, almost leisurely, and when it fired once. One shot from the main cannon. The asteroid shattered into 4 large pieces that tumbled slowly away from each other. The cruiser did not move again. It sat there in the silence afterward like it was bored. 40 seconds from arrival to destruction, as Voreth had said. The Salmari fired the photon lance at a distance of 600,000 kilometers. Observers barely saw the weapon discharge, a brief pulse of light too fast for most visual sensors to track cleanly. The asteroid in question simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there. The next it was a faint expanding mist of superheated particles that the sensor arrays struggled to even classify as debris. The whole event lasted less than 2 seconds, start to finish. Several observers recalibrated their equipment. A few did it twice. The Phoenixy demonstrated exactly what Coronet had promised. The hollow wind did not appear on sensors until it was already at the target. No one had tracked its approach. It materialized from FTL at point-blank range, fired a spread of high-velocity precision rounds into every structural weak point of the asteroid simultaneously, and was gone again, back into FTL, before the first fracture lines had even finished forming. The asteroid broke apart 10 seconds later, slow and inevitable, like a building whose foundation had been removed. The hollow wind was already 3 light minutes away by then. The Akarath did not fire a weapon at all. Their ship, the Shifting Mind, approached the asteroid and activated its psionic array. There was nothing to see. The sensor feeds showed nothing unusual, but over the course of 4 minutes the asteroid's structural integrity collapsed from the inside. The rock simply fell apart as if it had forgotten how to hold itself together. Piece by piece, then faster, until there was nothing left but powder and pebbles drifting apart on their own momentum. The mind does not need to fire a gun to win, Elder San said quietly over the quantum link, to no one in particular. The 5 demonstrations had taken a little over an hour. By the time they were done, the mood among the observer vessels was settled, impressed, satisfied, and waiting for the final act with the particular attitude of people who had already seen the best and were now prepared to be politely underwhelmed by what remained. Then the human demonstration began. At first, nothing happened. The designated human target, the 6th asteroid, identical in size to the others, sat undisturbed at its position. The clock on the quantum link feed ticked forward, 30 seconds, 1 minute. The observers watched their sensor screens. Nothing was coming. No FTL signatures. No engine output in the area. No thermal readings. Siravel, watching from the Phoenixy observer vessel, leaned toward her screen. "Are they late?" she asked. Nobody answered because, at that exact moment, something appeared on the sensor feeds. Not in front of the asteroid. Behind the observer fleet. The readings came in fragments at first, as if the sensors were having trouble agreeing on what they were looking at. One screen showed a mass signature. Another showed a heat reading. A third showed nothing at all. Then the algorithms caught up with each other and the picture assembled itself, and every officer in every observer vessel looked at the result and sat very still. There was a ship behind them. It had been there the entire time. It had been there before the demonstration started. It had been there, according to the timestamps the sensors were now frantically producing, since before the observer fleet had even arrived in the zone. It had held its position, cold, dark, and completely undetectable, for over 4 hours while 6 species conducted their business, and not one sensor array in the fleet had found it. It was the UES Reckoning. Titan class. That was the designation in the slim, largely redacted file the intelligence services had on it. What the file had not conveyed, what no file could have conveyed without experiencing it directly, was the scale. The Reckoning was not the biggest ship in the zone. The Vreth Hive carrier was larger. But there was something about the way it looked that made size feel less relevant than it usually did. It was dark. The hull was not reflective. It absorbed light rather than scattering it, and at the edges it seemed to blur slightly, as if the boundary between the ship and the space around it was not entirely committed to being a straight line. The sensor arrays could read it now that it had chosen to be read, but the readings were strange. The mass was there. The power signature was there, and enormous. But the weapon systems, and there were clearly weapon systems, did not match anything in any catalog that any of the observer ships carried. The reckoning turned. It was a slow turn, deliberate and unhurried, and it faced the sixth asteroid. Then it fired. Later, the observers would spend a great deal of time trying to describe what happened in those 8 seconds, and they would all struggle with it in different ways. It was not a single beam. It was not a spread of missiles. The best description anyone produced after reviewing the sensor recordings many times was that the ship had applied a series of extremely precise energy pulses to the asteroid in a specific sequence, each pulse targeting a different layer, a different structural component, working inward from the surface, not destroying, disassembling. The rock came apart not in an explosion, but in a controlled cascade, layer after layer separating and falling away in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, like watching something being unpacked rather than demolished. 8 seconds. When it was done, the debris was already being collected. Small drones, dozens of them, launched from the reckoning during or possibly even before the demonstration, had spread through the debris field and were pulling pieces together in organized clusters, not leaving a mess, not scattering fragments across the zone as every other species had done, collecting the material as if it had value, as if waste was not something humanity was interested in. The zone fell silent. On the observer feeds, not a single voice spoke for 11 full seconds. Ciravel was counting without knowing she was counting. She watched the reckoning hold its position, dark and still again, and she thought of the way Ilara Voss had sat in that hall the day before, the same quality of stillness, the same refusal to perform. Then, on the sensor array, something happened that broke the silence in every observer vessel at once. The mass readings changed. Not from the reckoning, around the reckoning. Space has a texture to it, in the language of sensor arrays. Background radiation, microparticles, the faint gravitational murmur of distant objects. Experienced sensor operators learn to read this texture the way a sailor reads water. Small changes tell you things. And what the sensors were telling every observer ship now was that the texture of the space behind and around the reckoning was wrong. Too smooth in some places, too still in others. The Phoenixy sensor operator on the observer vessel was the first to say it out loud. She had been running a passive gravity gradient scan as a secondary check. An unusual choice, not standard procedure, but one that her instincts had pushed her toward ever since the reckoning revealed itself. "There are more ships," she said. Her commander looked at the screen. "How many?" She ran the count 3 times, because the first 2 felt impossible. 60, she said. 60 more ships, same class, they've been there the whole time. The reckoning had not come alone. It had never been alone. 60 Titan-class warships had been holding dark and silent in the space around the demonstration zone, undetected for hours. They had watched the entire event. They had positioned themselves without anyone's knowledge in a loose sphere around the observer fleet, not threatening, not weapons hot, but present. Completely, undeniably, terrifyingly present. On the Quantum Link feed, a single short message arrived from the human ship. No voice, no ambassador, just text 3 words long. Demonstration concluded. Thank you. And then the reckoning powered down its active systems and went quiet again. And 60 other ships did the same. And the observer fleet sat in the middle of all that silence and tried, very hard, to decide what to feel. Commander Skrix of the Vreth, watching the feed from the station, said nothing for a long time. Then he said one word in his own language, and the translation system rendered it as, "When?" His intelligence officer understood the question. "Unknown," she replied. "That is the problem." No one disagreed. The emergency session was not scheduled. There was no formal request, no advance notice sent through the proper diplomatic channels. It was arranged in the way that things are arranged when people are too unsettled to care about proper channels. A series of quick private messages sent between delegations within minutes of the observer fleet's reports arriving at the station, and within the hour, 5 of the 6 tables in the Great Hall were occupied again. The 6th was empty. Ilara Voss had not been invited. This was, all 5 delegations had silently agreed, a conversation that needed to happen without her. Admiral Voreth of the Duroc spoke first, because the Duroc had a long tradition of someone speaking first in uncomfortable silences, and that someone was always the most senior military officer in the room. "We need to establish what we know," he said. His voice was level, but he was gripping the edge of the table with one large hand in a way that would have been invisible to most observers. Commander Scrix noticed it. Scrix noticed everything. "We know very little," Scrix said. "That is the problem." What followed was unlike any meeting that the Conclave's Great Hall had hosted in its long history. It was not a competition. It was not a performance. It was 5 powerful civilizations comparing notes with the specific, slightly embarrassed energy of people who have just discovered that they all made the same mistake and none of them had caught it. They had each, independently, made assessments of humanity over the past several decades. They had each gathered intelligence. They had each reached conclusions, and those conclusions had, in every case, said something roughly equivalent to, "Young species, limited fleet, not a priority." Now they laid those assessments side by side and looked at them together, and the holes were obvious. The Vreth's intelligence files on humanity had 3 major gaps. The first was a period about 60 years ago, a sudden drop in civilian communication traffic, and a corresponding rise in encrypted military signals that had been flagged as unusual but never properly investigated. The second was the complete absence of any reliable information on the location of humanity's primary shipyards. They knew Earth. They knew a handful of colonies. They had no clear picture of where the ships were actually being built. The third gap was the most troubling. A list of 12 incidents over the past 30 years in which Vreth scout ships had been sent to gather closer intelligence on human space, and in every case had either returned early with partial data and no explanation, or had not returned at all. 12 incidents, not one report of an actual confrontation, not one body, not one wreck, simply absence. The Duroc files were different in content but similar in result. Voreth's people had focused their intelligence on human weapons technology, specifically trying to understand what kind of armament the human fleet was developing. Their analysis, conducted by the best technical minds the Duroc had, showed a clear pattern of development in the early years, early weapon classes, early energy systems, early hull designs, that then, about 40 years ago, simply stopped being visible. The development had not stopped. It was obvious from the demonstration that the development had not stopped. The information had stopped. Whatever the humans were doing in those final decades of development, they had done it in complete information silence. "They knew we were watching," Voreth said. "They knew from the beginning and they simply waited until they had something they did not want us to see." The room absorbed this. Speaker Lyris of the Psalmery brought forward something different. The Psalmery did not have a traditional intelligence service. They gathered information primarily through light-based long-range observation, a kind of highly advanced passive listening. What they had noticed, and noted in their files as curious but not alarming at the time, was a consistent, decades-long pattern of small, irregular energy pulses from human space. Not weapon tests. The signature was wrong for weapons. Not drive tests either. The Psalmery analyst who had reviewed them had ultimately categorized them as industrial output, normal production noise. Lyris had pulled those files again after the demonstration. She had run the numbers with fresh eyes and new information. That was not industrial noise, she said. That was 60 ships running engine calibrations in rotating schedules. One ship at a time, irregular intervals, low enough output to look like background industrial activity from a distance. She paused. They have been running those ships for years, long enough that the crews are trained, long enough that the systems are broken in and reliable. She paused again. The ships that were in that zone today were not new. They were ready. Coronet of the Phoenixy was leaning back in her chair with her fingers interlaced, watching the ceiling with an expression that was doing its best to look calm and mostly failing. "I want to discuss the stealth technology," she said. "Specifically, I want to discuss the fact that we do not have it and they do." This opened a long and somewhat painful exchange. Every species at the table had some form of stealth capability, low emission modes, light-absorbing surfaces, FTL masking. None of them had anything that came close to what the Reckoning and its 60 companion ships had demonstrated. Passive gravity gradient scanning, the technique that had finally detected them, was not a standard sensor mode. The Phoenixy operator who had caught the ships had done so essentially by accident, through an unconventional choice that most operators would not have made. If she had run a standard scan package, the ships would have remained invisible indefinitely. They had been invisible for 4 hours. In a live operational context, 4 hours was enough time to be anywhere, to be behind any fleet, to be in orbit above any planet. Elder San had been quiet through most of the meeting. When he finally spoke, the room gave him its full attention because San did not waste words. "I attempted a psionic scan of the human delegation's quarters last night," he said. "A passive one, low-level awareness only." Several delegates looked at him. This was, in strict diplomatic terms, a violation of standard conclave protocols. San acknowledged this with a slight inclination of his head. "I was curious," he said, and did not apologize. "What did you find?" Voreth asked. "Nothing," San said. "Not the nothing of an empty room, the nothing of a room that has been shielded. The humans are aware of psionic scanning. They have been apparently for some time. Their personnel are trained to contain their emotional output. Their quarters were lined with a passive blocking material that I did not identify until I had already encountered its effect." He folded his hands. "They have developed countermeasures to our primary unconventional weapon system without telling us. Without any public record that we have found. Simply, quietly, because it was sensible to do so." Scrix clicked once. "The drones," he said. "I sent micro-drones during the demonstration, after the Reckoning revealed itself, to gather close sensor readings on the hull." Every head at the table turned toward him. "They were returned," he said, "all of them, intact, placed outside our observer vessel's forward docking port." He paused. There was a note. "What did it say?" Coronet asked. Scrix's translator rendered the words with its usual neutral tone, but somehow it still managed to convey the particular quality of the moment. "You dropped these." Silence. Coronet's composure finally cracked, not into alarm but into something close to disbelief. "They collected our surveillance drones, in real time, during the demonstration, and returned them with a note." "Intact," Scrix confirmed. "They could have kept them," Lyra said quietly. "Analyzed the technology, reverse-engineered whatever we had in them." "They did not need to," San said. He let that sit for a moment. "They already know what is in them." The session continued for another hour, and by the end of it, a picture had emerged. Not a complete picture. There were still enormous gaps, and everyone at the table knew that those gaps were themselves information. What was known was this: humanity had spent 60 years building a fleet in near-total information silence. The fleet was larger and more advanced than any species at the table had accounted for. It was equipped with stealth capabilities that no one had yet matched, weaponry that no one could fully classify, and countermeasures against at least one unconventional weapon system that no one had known they had. and across every record of every instance in which another species had sent forces, scouts, pirates, border ships, probe drones, into conflict with humanity over the past 30 years, the pattern was the same. The incidents happened, and then they stopped. Every single time, with no public declaration, no formal warning, no visible military response, they simply stopped. The aggression ended. The ships that had been sent did not come back, and no one who had authorized them had ever mentioned it publicly, because to mention it publicly would require explaining what had happened, and none of them knew what had happened. They had all assumed the others knew. No one had asked. Voreth was the one who finally said what everyone in the room was thinking. "We need to call them in," he said. "The ambassador." He looked at the empty sixth table. "And we should have done it before now." Coronet sent the message herself. Personal, direct, no intermediaries. The reply came back in less than 2 minutes. It was short. "We'll be right there. Should we bring coffee for everyone or just ourselves?" Coronet read it twice. Then, despite herself, despite the weight of everything she had learned in the past several hours, she laughed. It was a short laugh, and it had quite a lot of nervousness in it, but it was real. Siravel, standing at the back of the room, smiled too. She realized, stopped being surprised by humanity about halfway through the morning. She was not sure if that was reassuring or the most unsettling thing of all. She decided to decide later. Right now, there was a meeting to prepare for. Ilara Voss walked into the great hall carrying 2 cups of coffee. One was for her. The other she placed on the table in front of Siravel as she passed, with a small nod and the kind of smile that did not require explanation. Siravel looked down at the cup, then back up at the ambassador, and said nothing, but she held the cup with both hands and did not put it down for the rest of the meeting. Kale followed 2 steps behind, carrying a flat case in both hands. He set it on the human table, sat down quietly behind it, and folded his hands in his lap. The room was different from the day before. The displays were off. There were no holograms, no ship models floating in the air, no carefully prepared presentations. Just 6 tables in a circle, and the people sitting behind them, and a particular quality of honesty in the air that had not been present at the formal summit. It had the feeling of a conversation that had needed to happen for a long time and was only now being allowed to. Admiral Voreth spoke first again. Old habit, but his voice had changed slightly from the day before. The controlled authority was still there, but underneath it was something that took Ilara a moment to identify. It was respect. Real respect, not the performance of it. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "we owe you a more honest conversation than the one we had yesterday." "You don't owe me anything," Ilara said. She was not being modest, she was being accurate. "Yesterday was what it was, today is what it is. I'd rather spend the time we have on what comes next." She opened the flat case that Kale had set on the table. Inside was a single document. Printed on paper, which was itself a choice. Paper could not be remotely deleted or intercepted or altered after the fact. She removed it and set it on the table where everyone could see it, then turned it to face the room. It was a treaty, a full treaty, comprehensive and clearly the product of years of careful drafting. The text was long enough to fill the document without any wasted space, and the layout was clean, structured, readable, direct. The kind of document written by people who had thought about every word and were not interested in leaving anything ambiguous. Commander Scrix leaned forward and read the heading. His translator rendered it: Treaty of Co-Equal Standing, Proposal for Formal Recognition of the Terran Confederation as a Founding Power of the Galactic Conclave. "We've had this ready for 3 years, Ilara said. "We've been waiting for the right moment to bring it forward." She looked around the circle of tables. "We thought this was the right moment." Voreth read the first section in silence. Then he looked up. "This is not a request," he said. "It's not worded as a request." "No," Ilara agreed. "It's worded as a proposal between equals." There was a pause that lasted long enough to mean something. Then Voreth said, "Yes, it is." And something in the room shifted, not dramatically, not with any outward ceremony, but in the way that things shift when an unspoken truth is finally spoken aloud and everyone can stop pretending they hadn't known it all along. The discussion that followed lasted 4 hours. It was detailed and sometimes difficult. There were points of contention, resource-sharing arrangements, territorial boundary definitions, mutual defense clauses that required careful negotiation, because each species had different ideas about what defense meant and what it obligated. The Phoenixi pushed back on several economic provisions. The Duroc wanted clearer language around military sovereignty. The Salmari raised concerns about technology exchange timelines that took an hour to resolve. Humanity negotiated every point from the same position, calm, prepared, unhurried. For every clause that was challenged, Alara had an answer ready, and the answer was always reasonable, and it was always offered without the kind of pressure that would have made the other side feel cornered. She was not trying to win. She was trying to reach something that would last. The Akarath raised only one objection during the entire session. Elder San looked at a clause near the end of the document, a mutual intelligence transparency clause, and said, "This provision requires each party to disclose the current size and location of its active fleet to the others." "It does," Alara confirmed. "The Terran fleet's full size and location is not currently known to any party in this room," San said. He said it without accusation, just as a fact. "Also true," Alara said. "That would change upon signing." San was quiet for a moment. "How large is the full fleet, Ambassador?" Alara looked at him with an expression that was thoughtful and open. She said, "Large enough that we feel comfortable sharing the answer as part of a formal treaty process, and not comfortable sharing it in an informal session that isn't bound by the same agreement." San considered this, then he nodded once. "That is a reasonable position," he said. By the early evening of that second day, the treaty was signed. Each species did it differently, as each species did everything differently. The Vreth pressed a limb mark into a seal compound. The Duroc used a formal blade to notch the document in the ancient style, the same mark a Duroc commander made on a victory post after a battle, signifying a resolution concluded with honor. The Salmari pressed a pulse of coherent light through a recording crystal embedded in the document's binding, leaving a permanent energy signature. The Phoenixi signed with a stylus in quick, sharp strokes. The Akarath touched the document briefly and left a thermal impression of their palm, a gesture that, in their culture, was reserved for agreements made without reservation. Alara signed last with a pen. A physical pen, the kind with ink, the kind people had been using on Earth for hundreds of years before space travel. She had carried it in her jacket pocket since leaving Earth 2 weeks ago. When she was done, she capped the pen and put it back in her pocket and looked at the signed document on the table. She did not say anything for a moment. She did not need to. Then Vorath stood. The Duroc were not known for ceremony. They were known for 4,000 years of recorded military history, and in that history, the bow was reserved for specific, significant moments. Moments of genuine recognition between parties who had earned it. Vorath had not performed a formal bow to a non-Duroc in his entire career. His analysts had looked at that fact and noted it with interest before the summit. His aides had wondered if today would be different. It was different. He stood fully to his considerable height and inclined his upper body forward in a slow, deliberate movement that the Duroc cultural scholars would later document as the deepest formal bow recorded outside of intra-Duroc military tradition. It lasted 3 seconds. When he straightened, his expression had not changed. Duroc faces did not change easily, but his eyes were direct and clear. "The Duroc hegemony recognizes the Terran Confederation," he said, "as an equal." It was not a long sentence, but in the language of 4,000 years of Duroc military honor, it was the longest thing he could have said. One by one, the others followed. Scrix of the Vreth extended both primary arms, which was the Vreth gesture for acknowledging a peer, a gesture given between hive commanders and almost never to outside species. Lyris of the Salmari pulsed with a warm amber light that, in Salmari emotional language, meant something close to welcome. Coronet of the Fenexi offered a quick, sharp smile and a raised cup of water in the direction of Alara's coffee, the nearest she could get to matching the gesture. And San of the Akarath reached forward and placed 2 fingers briefly on the table between himself and the human delegation, which was, for an Akarath, an act of deliberate openness, letting the other party feel his presence without shielding. It was, in total, a very quiet ceremony. Nothing exploded. No one made a speech. The galaxy did not shake. But the 6th chair at the conclave table had been occupied, and it would not be empty again. 1 year later, the UES Reckoning was on standard patrol in the outer edge of human space. The route was long and mostly uneventful, which was exactly how Captain Dren Yusuf liked it. He was a tall, quiet man in his late 40s who had been commanding capital ships for 16 years and had learned early that the best days were the boring ones. He was standing at the observation deck, which was his habit in the late watch hours when the crew was mostly on rotation and the ship was at its most peaceful. The stars outside moved slowly as the Reckoning held its heading, and somewhere behind him, 60 other ships held formation in the dark. The ensign who approached him was named Tarek, and he was young enough that he still got visibly nervous when he talked to the captain, which Yusuf found both endearing and useful. "Sir," Tarek said, "I have a question, off the record." "On patrol," Yusuf said, without turning from the window, "everything is off the record." Tarek considered how to phrase it. "We spent 60 years building this fleet. The shipyards are still running, we train every day, we maintain every system, and now we have the treaty, we have the 6th chair, we're recognized, we have allies." He paused. "So why are we still building? Why does the fleet keep growing?" Yusuf was quiet for a moment. He watched the stars. He thought about the answer the way he thought about most things, not searching for it, but letting it come. "You know what's funny about this fleet?" he said. "In 60 years we haven't fired a shot at another civilization. Not one. Not in anger, not in defense, not in warning." He let that sit. "There have been situations, moments where things could have gone differently, but they didn't, and you know why." Tarek waited. "Because they looked," Yusuf said. "Because at some point, every species that thought about starting something took a look at what was standing next to us in the dark, and they did the math, and they decided it wasn't worth it." He turned from the window. "That's the whole point, Tarek. The best war is the one that never starts. You build until no one in the galaxy is willing to find out how the story ends." Tarek looked at him for a moment, then nodded. It was the nod of someone who had asked a question expecting a short answer and received the real one instead. "Go get some sleep," Yusuf said. "We're at Waypoint Keller in 6 hours." Tarek went. Yusuf turned back to the window. The Reckoning moved on through the dark, patient and quiet and ready, and 60 ships followed behind it like a promise. Not a threat, not a boast, not a performance for anyone's benefit. Just a fact. The kind of fact that, once understood, changed the way the whole galaxy understood everything else. Far away in the great hall of Conclave Station Orin, 6 chairs sat in a circle, all of them occupied. The 6th one had a small coffee ring on the surface of the table beside it, faint, old, barely visible. No one had cleaned it off. No one was going to.